I'm going to start by removing the wheel, 19mm socket, remove all of these little caps that hold on your hubcap, if you have steel wheels with hubcaps, that is. Set this aside. Again, 19mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts, and then take the wheel off. Before I move any further, I want to separate the inner and outer tie rod by loosening up on this jam nut. This one's in pretty poor condition, but hopefully it loosens up. You might need a hammer to tap on your wrench. Use a 21mm wrench. There we go, it did break free. If not, you could heat it up using a torch. Now let's loosen up the stud nut for the outer tie rod. Okay, there we go. Lift up on the tie rod end. If yours doesn't come out, you can use a hammer. And then hammer on the knuckle right there. That should pop it out. At this point, you want to unscrew the outer tie rod end, but you want to count the amount of turns that it takes to take it off so that when you put it back on, you can get it close to a decent alignment so that you can drive down to your local alignment shop safely and get yourself a proper alignment. Took 12 turns for me, but of course for you it's going to be different. And I'd do the same to the other side. Now if you look through the wheel well here, you'll see the coupler for the steering shaft. It's a little rusty, so I sprayed it down with some rust penetrant, and now I'm going to use my 11mm socket and take out this pinch bolt that you see here, which locks it all in. There it is. Take this out. At this point, I opened the door and went inside the vehicle, and I want to straighten out the steering wheel. So I don't want to take the steering rack out or disconnect it completely before the steering wheel is perfectly centered. So to ensure that, I know that this is the centered position, but just to double check it, I'm going to turn it all the way to the left, and I'm going to count the turns that it takes to go all the way to the right. It takes 3 turns, so 1.5 turns one way should be the center. That's half and 1. Now we're centered. At this point, I want to tie off the steering wheel so that it doesn't accidentally spin while I'm down there working. It can move a little bit, that's fine, it just can't make full rotations. So I grabbed a bungee cord and I tied the bottom of the steering wheel, and I hooked the bungee cord down to the seat adjuster lever because these are manual seats. Otherwise you just find a different spot on the seat, that's what I usually do, and just tie it off. Now like I said, it can still move, but it's not going to go around and around and do a bunch of turns without me knowing. Just going to leave it like this. That's good. Now back underneath, we have to try to separate the steering shaft from the steering rack. And by the way, the reason I didn't tie the steering wheel until the last moment was so I can spin the steering shaft if needed, so I can get to the bolt. Now what I'm going to do is stick a pry bar in here and use a hammer on the end of the pry bar and basically just hammer up, and hopefully that breaks it free. There we go. Almost. Oh. There we go. That's off. Next, you'll have 2 main bolts holding this steering rack in place. One is right here with a nut on top, and you can get the bolt from underneath, and it looks the same on the other side. And that bolt is actually this one over there, right next to the control arm bolts. So I'm going to hold the nut with an 18mm wrench, then I'm going to get my 18mm socket on the bolt, loosen it up. There's one. Up on top, you have a nut at the very top and then a washer in between the bushing on the rack and the nut itself. So make sure you have both of these items and you don't lose them. And once the other side main mounting bolt is loose, you can just go ahead and pull it straight out through the driver's side. It won't come out the passenger side. Okay, so I'm going to take out this through bolt over here for the engine mount. I'm going to do the same to the front mount, also an 18mm socket, except here you take off the nut, not the bolt. And once the nut is off, you can push the bolt through. There it is. Now at this point, I'm going to stick a pry bar between the transmission and the engine. Pry forward, and this should give us the space we need to take this out. There it is. Okay, there's your old steering rack. Next, what we have to do is called centering the rack. So assuming you have your new rack right here, this is what it would look like. It comes with inner tie rods. And now you want to put some pliers. I like to just use locking pliers so I can lock them on here on the shaft of the steering rack here. And I'm just going to go all the way to one side until it stops. So right here, I'm bottomed out going that way, and I'm going to start counting the turns that it takes to go completely in the other direction. 1, 2. Okay, I'll call it 3 turns. But basically my pliers are here, this is here, so it's basically 3 turns. But I will take into account this a little bit when we center it. But basically now you want to divide it by 2, that's 1.5 turns. So 1 is over here, approximately, and half a turn would be here. But because we didn't have those full 3 turns, I'm just going to go like this, and that should be half of that small difference there. Now, because in this instance the steering rack has these 2 flat cutouts here, even if you make minor adjustments like this, it's not going to be off because it can only go on one way unless it is 1 whole turn off. And it has this cutout here for the bolt as well. You can see that right there. So basically, fine adjustments or small movements will not affect how this is going to end up, because let's say I accidentally move it when I'm putting it in and it ends up like this. Well, I can look at the tie rods and see that they're centered, so I'm just going to bring it back to where it was. Now again, assuming you have your new one, let's put it into the vehicle. Slide the rack in, make sure you don't grab any wires with it and accidentally rip them out. There's a electrical connector. There's the ABS wire here, and then another electrical connector further in, so just be careful. So right here it's getting stuck on this engine mount. The bushing for the rack doesn't have room, but it doesn't have room by 1 millimeter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my pull jack right here, jack up the front of the engine, tilted forward a little bit, and that should give me the clearance I need. I'm going to put the pull jack right here. Definitely don't go on the transmission pan or even in the center of the oil pan. Just go on the front like this and just tilt it forward. Right. Well, it's in. I'm going to slide one of the bolts in and try to line it up with the bushing. Okay, get the washer on and the mounting nut. I'm not going to tighten it yet. I'm going to thread it on a little bit by hand just so I can make sure that it's secured in there. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing to the passenger side. I'm going to tighten both of the through bolts that go on the power steering rack, and the torque for these is 52 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. Do the same to the passenger side. Now torque it to 52 foot-pounds. I'm going to make sure that the nut doesn't spin. Okay, it's spinning, so I have to hold it. That's 52. And now let's go 90 degrees. I have a torque wrench that can read degrees. If you don't, just do 1/4 of a turn. That's what that actually means. The only advantage of having the torque wrench that reads degrees is you can ratchet it backwards, and it'll keep track of what you've already turned. And that's it right there. Get your wrench off. And now do the same thing to the passenger side bolt. If you had to use a support here at the front of the engine, go ahead and remove it. Next, I need to line up my engine mount bolts, and to do that I'm just going to use a long pry bar in here, and this will allow me to move the engine, rock it back and forth however I need to in order to line up the bolts. Okay, this front one actually lines up just fine as it is, so I'm going to put the bolt through, but but I'm not going to fully tighten it yet. I want to leave it loose so that it still has a little bit of wiggle to it. That way I can have an easier time lining up the rear. The rear looks like it kind of lines up, so I'm going to try and get this bolt through. Okay, there we go, this one's through. Okay, I can't get a torque wrench in there, but I made that one nice and tight. Let's tighten up the front nut too. The bolt has a little wing on it, so it's supposed to just stay in place without spinning. Perfect. The torque for this is 66 foot-pounds. It's actually the same as the rear. It's just that on the rear, like I said, I can't get a torque wrench to accurately torque in there, so that's why I didn't torque that one. This one will be easy to torque. That's it right there. Now it's time to reconnect the steering shaft. I have to block your view for a second here, but basically you just want to push the shaft up and slide it over. So I got it on there a little bit. Now, so I don't block your view, I'm going to use this pry bar and push it on. There we go. However, if you notice, it's not lined up anymore. And basically to do that, I'm just gonna, there we go, grab the tie rod and pull it. What we have to do is actually get a little hammer and tap down on this, and that will get it all put back together for us. Now, as you're tapping it down, you wanna make sure that you're tapping here and not up on the joint here, where the U-joint is, because that's how you ruin it. Well, what I'm going to try now is to stick a pry bar in here and very gently pry this down, and hopefully it'll kind of situate itself onto the steering rack for me. There we go. I think it went a tiny bit too far, so I'm going to bring it back up a little. Stick the bolt through. If it doesn't go through, that means you're not lined up with the slot. I'm going to go ahead and make this thing nice and tight. I'm not going to be able to get a torque wrench in here and accurately torque it, so this is all I have. See, that's pretty tight. Next, I like to cover these threads in some anti-seize. That way the tie rod and the jam nut don't seize on here in the future, and it helps out your alignment professional. Now you can take your outer tie rod and put it back the same amount of turns that it took to take it off. All right, so here we go. Let's put it back into the knuckle, line it up, press it down, and put on the castle nut underneath. Let's bottom it out and torque it. 18 foot-pounds for this nut right there. And now you want to line up the cotter pin slot with the hole on the stud, and if it doesn't line up, you always want to tighten and not loosen to line it up. I have to go a little bit further for mine. Right there, looks like it's perfect, so let's put in the cotter pin, slide it in, and bend it over to lock it. One last thing that you can't forget is to lock your jam nut up against the tie rod. So use your 21mm wrench, give it a quick snug, just like that. And then I like to straighten the tie rod back out so it's not sitting at an angle here on the knuckle. Now do the same to the other side. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 100 foot-pounds. And now if you have hubcaps, go ahead and put those back on and make sure that you line up this hole with the valve stem, otherwise the valve stem will get crushed. Line up all these little caps and thread them on by hand is what I recommend, otherwise they might strip out and then your hubcap won't be attached properly and it can go flying off the car on the road, and that would not be good. There you go. Take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop.